Well, good morning, everyone, and I appreciate the opportunity to just talk a few minutes about what we're seeing out there in our cornfields and give a little disease update, and also share with you some questions that I've been getting over the last couple of weeks. And so we're going to go through some of those issues, and then I want to sort of wrap it up and just kind of leave you with some things to think about as the season winds down and as we get ready for harvest. So I think the question that I've been asked most frequently over the last week is on the disease southern rust. And so I'm going to give you just a brief update on what's new and what questions we've been getting about that disease. And so for those of you who might not be aware, we confirmed southern rust for the first time in 2020 last week on July 20th. And in the last week, we've had a few different confirmations in some counties. All of those counties have been in western Kentucky. And the good news is that in all of these situations where we've confirmed the disease, we've found it at fairly low incidence and severity. And I can give you an example. We found it here in Caldwell County on the 20th. And I've looked at a lot of cornfields across the county, and it's very hard to find. I've only found it in a couple of fields on our research farm. And it's just a few pustules here and there. So that's the good news, is that it's out there, but at least from what I'm hearing and what we're seeing here is that it is at a very low level of disease over the last week. Now, I also want to just mention that I've gotten a lot of calls. I've heard a lot of reports. People have been asking about potential southern rust more towards the central and eastern part of the state. But so far, we have not confirmed any southern rust in the central or eastern part of Kentucky. Now, there is a lot of the disease common rust in these areas, and that's a disease that's very easy to confuse with southern rust. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to tell the difference between those two in a minute. But just to give you sort of a visual of what we're seeing for southern rust confirmations, this is a map that tracks in real time where southern rust has been confirmed in the United States at any given time point. And this is going to be easy to follow along if you're interested. This is our corn IPM pipe site, and this is going to be one way that you can kind of keep on top of where there's confirmed observations of southern rust. And just to let you know, wherever you're seeing a county or parish that's red on this map, that indicates that it has been confirmed that southern rust is in that area. And so you can see from our map on Kentucky, I mean, I think we can safely assume that not all of the counties in western Kentucky have turned red, but it could be out in some of those counties in low levels, even if we're not seeing it red. So it just reemphasizes the importance of going out scouting and making sure you're aware of what's going on in your cornfield. So right now, like I said, we're seeing a lot of common rust, but we're also seeing, now in the western part, we're seeing a little bit of southern rust out there too. And so if you ever read any of the tips or tricks of how we distinguish these two diseases when we're out in the field, lots of times you'll hear about how we determine which is by where these pustules are produced on the surfaces of the leaves. And so we sort of always think that southern rust is going to have those pustules produced on the upper surface of the leaf, where common rust is going to produce pustules on both surfaces of the leaf. And another tip or trick I often hear or get asked questions about is that, based on how those pustules are clustered on the leaf. So sometimes southern rust, it seems like there's just a big cluster of pustules on the leaf, whereas common rust can sometimes be more scattered. When we're thinking about those leaf surfaces, these are just a couple pictures that are going to illustrate what that's going to look like on the corn leaf. And so the picture on your right is going to be the underside of a leaf that's infected with the fungus that causes southern rust. And you can see there that you're not seeing a lot of those pustules on the underside of the leaf. And that's in contrast to the picture on the left, where the underside of the leaf has a lot of the pustules, and that's common rust. Now, I also like to showcase these two pictures because I think it sort of shows that diagnostic tip of the densely clustered pustules versus the scattered pustules may not always be a good one in the field, because that particular case of common rust, it has a lot of very densely clustered pustules there, and so that might be a little bit of a hindrance when you're trying to diagnose it out in the field. And there are also some problems with using sort of that leaf surface, or where the pustules are in the leaf surface, as a diagnostic tip too. And that's because, we have documented that common rust can sometimes only produce those pustules on the upper surface. I mean, that's something that we've observed from time to time, and so that can confound diagnosis. And then occasionally we see southern rust pustules on the lower leaf surface, and this is mostly going to happen if we have some, like a wind event or some sort of damage in the cornfield, where a leaf might get flipped and stay turned over with the underside of the leaf facing up. And if that happens, sometimes we might see some southern rust pustules on the underside of the leaf too. So really, the tips and tricks are helpful, but if you want to know for sure and get a really accurate diagnosis on whether or not you have southern rust in a field, the fastest and best way to do that is to send some samples to your county agent. They can get that to our plant disease diagnostic labs, and we can get those samples turned around fairly quickly. And then you'll know and be able to make an informed decision on whether or not we need to be applying a fungicide to manage southern rust. So every year I get asked also, where southern rust come from? Is this a typical time of year that it's here, and what should we be doing with that? And so just as a little refresher, just remember the southern rust fungus, it doesn't survive our Kentucky winters. It needs a living host. It needs corn plants to survive, and so once we get to harvest and our corn plants die back, that fungus is going to go with it. And it's actually going to survive down in Mexico and maybe even far south Texas. And then each year, it's just those spores of that fungus are just going to blow north on wind currents or storm systems and move up into our area. And really, we think about the conditions that favor the disease as being, kind of the midsummer. We see it about mid-July every year in Kentucky, and that's right when we start to have the conditions, or the weather conditions, that are really favorable for this disease. So we think warm days, warm nights, lots of humidity, these pop-up rain showers, or sort of extended periods of heavy dews in the mornings. Basically your typical Kentucky summer. Those are going to be the conditions that really favor this disease. And we've had some good conditions for southern rust development over the last week in parts of western Kentucky. So if we're out there and we're scouting and you do find the disease, or you're in a county where it's been confirmed, I often get a lot of calls, okay, well, what do I need to do now? And it's important to just remember that it is important to make a decision, but you do have a little bit of time. You don't need to panic. If you're not sure what you have, or if you want to get a confirmation, you have time to get a sample diagnosed, get it to your county agent. They'll get it to the diagnostic lab. And like I said, our diagnosticians are really good about getting those samples turned around pretty quickly, and so you'll still have time to make a decision on how you would like to manage the disease. But really, your management decisions are going to be based on the growth stage of the crop when it's confirmed in a field, and what the weather is doing. And if we have those really favorable conditions, that decision might need to be made a little sooner. But if you're in one of the pockets of the state that's missed a lot of these pop-ups, or it's hot and it's dry and it's confirmed, you do have time to wait and see how the disease is going to develop before you need to take action. And that's going to be really important, because the action that we need to take for southern rust, as you all know, is going to be spraying fungicide, right? And so then the question becomes, okay, if we need to spray, when do you need to spray? And so we have some scenarios, and I just always like to point out that these scenarios are going to be assuming that the weather is favorable for disease develop. Again, those warm nights, warm days, humid environment. But if you're in one of those pockets where the weather's not as favorable, you have time to scout and wait and determine if you need to have an application later in the season. When we're trying to decide on when we should spray corn if for southern rust management, I always like to point out this very handy table that's in one of our Crop Protection Network publications called Southern Rust. And the link to the full publication is there on the screen, or your county agents also have a copy of this publication and can share it with you. But this table is going to be really helpful to determine whether or not you might see a benefit from spraying, and it's going to be based on the crop growth stage when southern rust is first detected. And so this is going to be based on research that comes from a lot of our southern colleagues where they deal with southern rust on an annual or a more frequent basis, and it's more typically yield limiting in those areas. And they've determined that basically if the corn is between tasseling and milk stage, it's probably going to benefit from a fungicide application, particularly if those weather conditions are really favorable. And so that's going to be a little bit wider window than we think of protecting for maybe some other foliar diseases like gray leaf spot. And that's just, again, attests to the fact that southern rust, under those optimal environmental conditions, it can build up very quickly and be rather yield limiting in certain years. And so that just shows that we need to be paying attention to what your growth stage is when southern rust is first found, and then we can determine if it's falling in that growth stage where we need to spray. I also like to point out that, a lot of the early April planted corn, or even mid to late April corn now, is really approaching or at that milk stage. And so a lot of those fields, if you have fields that are sort of further along, you could also just sort of wait and see with our low incidence and severity of southern rust. If you haven't applied a fungicide and aren't sure that you want to apply a fungicide to manage southern rust, you do have that option. The farther along your corn is, the less likely we are going to see significant yield impacts from southern rust, and so that's something to think about too. So the other question is, what do I spray? There's a lot of new products available, and there's a lot of products that are rated as very good against southern rust. And if you're interested in sort of seeing what your options are, we do have fungicide efficacy guides available. These guides are going to be based on our Kentucky data, but also data from other plant pathologists on fungicide efficacy across the U.S. And these are updated annually, so they do have efficacy from some of the newer products as well. And again, I have the link here on the page, but also your county agents all have copies of this or can get copies to you so that you can look and see sort of what products you might want to be using if you need to use a fungicide for southern rust management. And I always point this out too because there are products basically for every price point to control that are very good against southern rust. So there are a lot of different options that are good for southern rust control. Now, if you've already sprayed or your client's already sprayed at tasseling before rust was detected, there's always that question of, do you need to spray again? And this one, it really depends. It's going to depend on the growth stage and the weather. But in general, we don't often need to have a second application, particularly if your field has gotten to blister stage or R2, then there's not going to be as much of a benefit from applying that fungicide. But of course, it's always important to scout and pay attention to the weather and be checking on that. But again, if we go back to this handy table, you can see here that if you look at that comment section, you can see that once corn gets through that blister stage, if you've already sprayed once, you're probably less likely to need another application of the disease. And again, right now in Kentucky, that's good because we have, again, low incidence and severity of southern rust. It hasn't really been that explosive type of disease at this point in time, and so that gives us a little bit more time to see if corn can hit blisters, so we might not need to spray again. Now, we've talked a lot about southern rust over the last week, but I just want to briefly mention some of our other foliar diseases. And I think the good news for Kentucky is that before we got southern rust about a week ago, a lot of corn looked really good with pretty low disease levels. Even though we've had some warm, humid conditions and we're seeing some gray leaf spot move, a lot of the corn is at a point where we might not expect to see a lot of yield damage from gray leaf spot unless it's really, really late planted corn. We are seeing more northern corn leaf blight. That's going to be the picture of the disease that's on the bottom there. And this one is interesting. Usually we see it more when we have cooler conditions in the summer, but we're seeing a little bit more of it this year out there in fields. And when we think about managing these diseases, some of these diseases, particularly if you have a susceptible hybrid or some of the other disease risk factors like no-till or continuous corn, you might be needing fungicides to manage some of these diseases. But our optimum timing for a lot of these diseases is going to be that tasseling, early silking stage. And so, if your field was really clean, you weren't having a lot of disease problems, and you're already through the blister stage, you probably aren't going to have to worry about the impact of a lot of these foliar diseases this year. And just to briefly mention, when we might see the best benefit from a fungicide application, because we're sort of leaving that tasseling stage, and now we're sort of looking more towards, in a few weeks, we're going to be out there walking fields and looking at, whether or not these fungicides had an impact and what type of yield response we might expect to see from those fungicide applications that went on at tassel. And I always like to remind everyone that yield response is going to be based on a variety of factors, and where we see the best yield response, or sort of what I would consider the highest economic response, are going to be when we have these factors that are listed here on this slide. If you have hybrids that are susceptible to disease, these disease risk factors that you see here, irrigation, no-till or conservation tillage, if the weather's been really favorable, and you're applying it tasseling, those are going to be the fields where, if we have disease develop, we're going to be more likely to see significant or economic yield responses from fungicides. And I always just like to point out that, if we're not seeing a double-digit yield increase from a foliar fungicide application, or maybe you're not as pleased with the response that you would have expected to see, always go back and look at these factors and see, okay, did you have, some of these factors? Did disease develop in that field? Because again, the more of these factors you have in a given field, those are going to be the fields that are going to be most likely to respond to a foliar fungicide application. I do want to point out, just take a few minutes and point out a couple of diseases that we are seeing that are, I would say, emerging in Kentucky, or a little bit less common. I've gotten a lot of questions, a lot of pictures texted to me over the last couple of weeks, particularly on this one, which is Diplodia leaf streak. And this is a disease we've had in Kentucky for several years. It's been in the southeast U.S. for quite a while, but we are starting to see more of the disease. And while our literature, and if you look sort of back at the reports, it says this disease isn't really linked to yield loss. And that's something, we are seeing so much of it though, we're starting to wonder if it could be having an impact on yield. And so this is one to just pay attention to. And if you're seeing something that you think might be impacting yield, let us know. We'd be interested to know if you think it's having an impact on your yields. But identification of this is really key, because in its early stages that you can see over there on your left, it's really easy to confuse with gray leaf spot. And then as the disease progresses, you can see more to the right, it's going to be more easy to confuse with northern corn leaf blight. Some tips on how you might diagnose this or tell it apart from gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight is that in those early stages, you can see on that picture on the left, you can see there's sort of these concentric rings in those lesions, and they also expand across leaf veins, whereas gray leaf spot really, it stays very parallel, and a narrow lesion that stays within those leaf veins. The middle picture is going to be sort of what it looks like as it's starting to expand, and again you can see it's sort of crossing those leaf veins, but it never really loses those concentric rings where that infection point occurred. And so that can help when you're trying to tell it from northern corn leaf blight. Over there on the picture on the right, you can see that sort of concentric ring where infection point occurred. And also, if you look really close at that picture, you're going to see these really small, round, black structures in the center of the lesion. And those are going to be the fungal structures of the fungus that causes Diplodia leaf streak. And that can be a good way to tell it from northern corn leaf blight when you're out in the field. If you have your trusty hand lens with you, you can look for those structures. And if they're there, that's a good indication that you have Diplodia leaf streak. I just want to say a word about Holcus leaf spot because we saw so much of it this spring and it's still out there in a lot of fields, and we've had some concerns about this disease. But this is one that, you know, it's out there, we see it, but it's just sort of an oddity and it doesn't really have an impact on yield. This is a bacterial disease. It survives in residue, and when we have really wet springs like we had this year, that bacterium just sort of splashes up onto the leaves and causes these tan lesions that are very round and often have a halo with them. And so it's just one we see out there, but not one that we need to worry about. Holcus is easy to confuse with curvularia leaf spot, and that's one that's also sort of an emerging disease in Kentucky. And I like to point out, since we first officially confirmed this disease in Kentucky in 2018, although we were observing it a couple years prior to that. But it is a fungal disease. It's one that's sort of important and can cause yield loss in some of the tropics and in corn production areas in China. So we want to be paying attention to this. Some of my colleagues in states to the south have been very concerned about this disease over the last couple of years and monitoring it for yield loss. And it's going to have very small tan lesions, often surrounded by a yellow halo. You can see there on the picture on your right what it looks like very early on, also with some Diplodia leaf streak early, and then the picture on your left is showing it just a little bit more progressed. So small lesions, yellow halo. Again, if you're seeing this out there in fields, let us know if you think it's impacting your yield. And I just want to sort of wrap it up today, just a quick note of something to think about as we head into harvest, and that's going to be our ear rots. In our areas where we've had some frequent rains or some of these pop-up rains around tasseling and in through silking and into blister, those kind of conditions where we get rainfall at that point in time, those are going to be conditions that favor Diplodia ear rot. Remember, our ear rots, although we don't see them until the end of the year, the infections are actually occurring sort of in that silking and just past window. So a lot of rain around silking can cause problems with Diplodia ear rot. And then if you're in one of the pockets of the state that's maybe been a little heat stress during silking and pollination, maybe a little bit drier than we'd like, keep an eye out for Fusarium ear rot. It's one that we have been easily able to pick up in Kentucky over the last couple of years. And so it's just one to kind of, when you're doing your pre-harvest scouting fields, take a look for these two ear rots. Always remember that an ear rot problem is much easier to manage before harvest than if you have a bunch of moldy grain that you're trying to figure out what to do with after harvest. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now I'll wrap it up just basically by saying that, you know, there have been a lot of questions about diseases over the last few weeks, particularly about southern rust and fungicide use. Scouting is going to be really important this year because it's not widespread in the state, and where we are seeing it, it's still at pretty low levels. So there is going to be time to make decisions about fungicide applications, and whether or not you need a fungicide is going to depend on that corn growth stage when it's detected and what the weather is doing. And so pay close attention to both of those things. And just remember that a lot of the resources that we talked about today and your county agents are going to have those, and they're also going to be a great resource if you need to get samples diagnosed, and so keep them in mind for that. And then I always like to point out that we talk a lot about southern rust, but there are some other diseases that we just need to be keeping on our radar. Remember that those applications that occur at tasseling or early silking for fungicides are usually going to be the most profitable if they're needed. I talked a lot about publications from our crop protection network. These is basically, it's just another extension output that's putting together regional or national publications, and you can access those on that website there. And then if you want some more information, we're always posting, you know, the latest on southern rust or other diseases on our Kentucky Pest newsletter. And we talked a lot about some diseases today, but if you're interested in learning more about what we're doing for corn fungicide research, we have a active program here in Princeton where we're focusing on optimizing fungicide use in corn, and we're going to talk a lot more about that on the virtual pest management field day on August 20th. And I put a link up here where you can get more information about that. And so that is what I have for you guys today. I'll stop sharing my screen, Carrie.
Thanks, Kirsten. Great information. And it looks like a couple of questions came in on the chat box, if you want to address those. And while you do that, I'm going to throw up a poll for the participants to take. This information that we get from the polls, we're going to have polls after each talk, and this is really good to help us as a group make sure that we're delivering the information that our clientele wants. So please take the time while Kirsten's talking through these questions to take this poll, and it should be live now.
Okay, so I see there's one question, and it's if corn is at the blister stage and southern rust was confirmed 2 counties away and rain is in the 7-day forecast, should I spray my corn for southern rust? And there's a couple different factors. My first response is it depends on what your risk tolerance is, right? But 2 counties away is a good, that's a good distance, and it would depend for me on if this is in Western Kentucky where we know the disease is, sort of out there at low levels, or if you're in Central and Eastern Kentucky. So the more east you go, I think the more time you have to maybe wait and scout and see if you're seeing it in your area or your county. If you're in Western Kentucky, I think you do it's probably out there at some level. But again, you always have the option of scouting and making the decision of whether or not you're going to spray based on whether or not you're finding it in your field. But we also know, I also say that if your applicator is ready to go, if your corn is at blister, if you have high yield potential in that field, and you're in Western Kentucky, and you're comfortable with spending the money for a fungicide application, that's also a choice too. So there's a lot of factors. I wish it was a more simple answer, but so there's a lot of factors that play there. But you always have time to scout, see if it's in your field, and then make that decision on whether or not you're going to spray. The next question is from John Grove, and it says, as we're looking to next year's hybrid selection, are there any emerging genetic resistance solutions to southern rust? And that's a great question. I know there are some hybrid differences in some of these hybrids and when we can see or how severe it is, but we don't have anything at this point that we would consider resistant to southern rust. And Unfortunately, I'm not on the inner loop of some of these companies to know how far along in breeding efforts, southern rust breeding efforts are going to be. So for next year, I would say there's probably not going to be what I would consider solid resistance options for southern rust. But hopefully in the future, and that'd be a great question to ask someone who's in a breeding role in our companies too.
Are there any more questions for Kirsten? If not, Kirsten, thank you. Sorry we can't do applause on Zoom, unfortunately, right? But I appreciate your time this morning, and I'm sure Kirsten would welcome any questions to her contact information should you think of more later, right?
Yes, of course.
Perfect.
Yep. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Carrie, and good morning. I want to give you a welcome to the virtual field day this morning, and I guess consider myself a virtual specialist these days, but we certainly do a lot of these kinds of things. Glad to see a number of participants still staying on. I want to talk about pre-harvest chores for good post-harvest management, and I need to, in fairness, preface by saying that this is focused more on some of the problems I've seen in the post-harvest side of production, or the post-harvest side of management. We'll not be talking about combine adjustments or so much on the equipment side, other than just the grain equipment that we deal with, dryers and grain bins. But I know a lot of farmers work with their dealers in setting up the combine before they get into harvest, and that's always a good idea, of course, to get it fine-tuned before we start harvesting. We want to minimize the damage, because that certainly does impact the storability of the crop. We'll talk about that as we go along. But I'll share my contact information at the end of the presentation, but they're starting out. I am located in Princeton and work with the fine folks that most of us on the program today. So the topics we want to cover again to kind of focus and look towards on the post-harvest side, some of the basic relationships. Want to look at shelf life. This impacts how we approach our harvest season a little bit. Want to talk about how our drying time can sometimes conflict, or if we don't want to exceed a drying time for the shelf life. Certainly, I'll give an example of that. I want to take a quick look at some of the things we already know about biology, how insects and moles impact grain storability, and how we can kind of prepare the harvest and prepare our equipment to reduce that kind of pressure in the grain bin. I've already heard of some problems carry over from last year, where a couple of farmers, this has been from one county recently, just last week, that they had loads rejected when they took them at the elevator because they had insect presence in the grain. So normally we don't store corn for 10 months in Kentucky, but if we do, we want to manage things a little bit differently, and we want to talk about that, and that's why it's one of the motivations for putting this together today. But I need to talk a little bit about equilibrium of moisture, not going to delve too much into that, but how that impacts storability. And the main pieces I want to talk about today connect with the integrated pest management side of post-harvest management, and that is SLAM. It stands for sanitation, loading, aeration, and monitoring. And again, as we look to the equipment that we have on the farms. I don't have a lot of time to talk about safety considerations, but we always need to mention that and keep it in the forefront of people's minds, because storability, or if we're going to have grain that goes out of condition, if we have crusting or cakes of grain in the bin, it's going to be hard to unload, and that can cause problems. And we have had some deaths recently, unfortunately, some this year already. People have been unloading grain and have been caught and trapped and suffocated in the bin. So that is always in the forefront when we talk about monitoring stored grain. And I'll close out with talking about some resources at universities and some that you may not know about that are available. But kind of launching into the talk, setting the stage here for the factors that impact storability. We know that grains do not improve the quality during storage. The best we can do is hope to maintain the quality, and really want to focus on how we can do that today. Much of it depends, obviously, on the moisture level of the grain going into storage. You may want to screen the crop for any other quality considerations, including mycotoxins, but those actually are impacted by moisture and temperature during the storage period, obviously. Maybe you may have some problems coming in from the field, as Kirsten kind of related to, and how you manage and scout your fields to plan the harvest as is approaching here in the next few weeks. Spend a little time talking about managing the broken corn and foreign material in a bin, how you may want to do it differently for larger bins that we're seeing on the farm these days versus smaller bins. But again, back to the harvest side, if we're operating our combines to minimize damage, that's going to be the first step in controlling that problem. I won't talk a lot about oxygen availability, but that can impact storability. Obviously, if we have a hermetic storage environment, that interacts with the moisture and temperature, which we can hold our grain safely. I want to take a quick look at the allowable storage time for corn. There's some other charts for other grains, and engineers are developing those. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a national meeting. It was a virtual meeting also, but we talked about tweaking this chart for soybeans, and that's under development. But some of the ones out there are to be used as guidelines, and all of this actually is used as guidelines, obviously, but this is looking at corn, the storability of corn for different temperature and moisture levels. And you can see as you go from right to left, as we reduce the temperature about 10 degrees, we are actually doubling the storability of corn. So kind of looking in the middle of the chart, as you go from 20 to 18, you're doubling the storage life of corn. But in early harvest, we don't have much time. Obviously, in summer, late August, early September, we're going to be in the 70-degree range. If we're harvesting high moisture corn, we don't have a lot of time. We don't want that corn sitting on a truck or in a wet holding bin for very long before we get to dry it out. And to stay ahead of any mycotoxin problems, we want to try to dry the crop to 16% or 15% within about 24 hours after harvest to be sure that it has this long storage life. Now, obviously, you can't do that with a natural air drying bin. We want to talk about that a little bit because then we want to definitely manage how we approach the harvest and our storage system, our drying system, rather. So if we take an example here at 60 degrees at 20% corn, we have about 29 days to get that crop dry before we lose a 0.5% of dry matter. And look at two drying examples here, simulations that I ran. We're looking at, in the first example, 75-degree outside air, humidity of 65%. The grain temperature is set the same at 75 degrees. And our goal is to dry the crop from 20 to 15. And that's a pretty, that can stress a lot of systems. But if we're looking at two systems here, 1 CFM or 2 CFM per bushel. And so the first chart shows the first condition there. And what we're showing is, in the colored lines on the top, refer to the axis on the left. The blue line is showing the moisture content change in the bottom layer of the bin. And this is without heat, of course. So again, the top layer is the last to dry. So you can see that it doesn't really start drying until about 21 days. And in that amount of time, we've got this other line is tracking from, relates to the dry matter loss on the right side of the graph. And you can see again, if we strike a 0.5% of dry matter loss, we've exceeded that after about 21 days in the top layer. So we want to avoid that condition. And how we can do that is to either reduce the depth of rain in the bin to improve or increase the airflow, or we may want to get a bigger fan. And as we prepare for harvest, that's one thing we want to kind of look at, how we might do that. But again, to take a same look at the same conditions, just doubling the airflow, we can cut that drying time in half and draw our line again across with a dry matter loss of 0.5%. And we can see that we are well under the limit. In about 13 and a half days, we can get that crop dry. So we can stay ahead of the spoilage. So I just wanted to share this because I have access to this program. I'd be glad to work with producers if they want to do some remodeling of the fans on their bins for drying and aeration. So we know that insects and molds cause a lot of problems in stored grain, and we've got some of those listed here and some examples, but where it can come back on us, of course, if we have high levels of insects in the bin, we might have a load rejected, as examples I pointed out earlier. If not that, we might get heavily discounted. And it's certainly not much fun to bring a full load of grain back from the elevator back to the farm. But even if you're docked, for a full-size truck, $100, $150 for the load, we want to avoid that as well. So take a quick look at the impact of temperature on stored, how insects react to temperature. We want to control that by keeping the grain cool. And obviously in the fall of the year, we can do that quite easily. But even starting in September, we can start controlling the cooling of the grain, and that's what I encourage folks to do, especially if you're holding wheat on the farm, to get that cool down to 60 degrees or lower as quickly as we can. And oftentimes you'll have opportunities to do that in Kentucky in September. Looking at moles, obviously they like warm condition, but they also like humidity, and that impacts their growth more so than temperature for the most part, just in general terms. And we can see here, just as a comparison of different species and the impact that are active in corn. If we can hold the humidity in the airspace in the bin at 70% or lower, we'll control mold activity. So again, think about that as we're preparing for harvest, and how that want to compare that then with equilibrium conditions and how that interacts with the moisture, temperature, and humidity range. So this is a equilibrium chart for yellow corn, and we know that if grain is exposed to these conditions for a longer period of time, as we saw in those drying curves before, we saw that the bottom layer dried to about equilibrium condition in about 5 days at that airflow rates we saw. And if it's in the field, it's going to reach conditions similar to what predicated by the equilibrium conditions. But if we back to the environment we want to control in the bin, if we are set 65% humidity as a safe zone or a safe target for controlling mold activity, and then we're controlling sacred temperature, we would be in this range shown on the table. And what I want to show in the next slide is it's the same information, but with the temperature scale expanded a little bit. So here we're looking at the middle line is a 65% humidity line, and the other ISO lines on the chart. The one in blue is shown there at 60%, and the one in red at 70% humidity. Then we're looking at different, again, for different grain moisture levels and different temperatures, how what is the safe zone. We can set the bounds for our safe zones over the season. So in wintertime in Kentucky, our average wintertime monthly temperature is around 35 degrees. And so we can hold corn actually about 15.5% in those conditions. But you can see that if you strike that line across, if we are holding corn at 15% in the summer, obviously it's going to be up above, well above the 70% humidity line, and running along the wall is going to be in that condition. So we want to try to protect against that. If we're going to hold corn in the summer, we want to dry it to 13%. We'll have a longer storage life, obviously. And then in the middle between that, if we're moving corn in, say, March or April or May, we can hold it at 14% safely and stay away from storage problems. As long as it's clean and we don't have a lot of insect pressure or mold pressure brought in from the field. So if you look at, I'm not going to show the other charts for the other grains, but essentially this is where we get our recommended moisture levels for different crops, for different holding periods. And I will say that, again, this is for grain that's in good condition coming into the storage. And again, this relates back to Kirsten's point. If you're scouting the fields and see some problems in the field, you probably want to get that harvested first and dry it quickly and store that separately from grain that would be in good condition. You don't want to mix those. If it's been compromised a little bit in the field, you have some mold pressure coming in from the field, you may want to lower these moisture levels about 0.5 point to a point as a little safeguard. And then the other piece is if we're holding grain for longer periods of time, say longer than a year, you may want to reduce these moisture levels another point to give us an extra margin of safety and stay away from problems. So when we're talking about drying below the market level, this is obviously an economic consideration with that. And I want to consider that as well as we go into harvest, but looking at current prices for major crops here, corn, wheat, and soybeans, if we're drying them a point below the market level for corn at $3.50, where it's going to cost us about 4 cents a bushel, and if we're holding it down to about 13%, we need to recover those costs with market decisions and be sure the market's going to reward us for that extra effort. Or the other option, obviously, is to sell it during cold weather and move it on and maybe take advantage of the markets in another way through options or other marketing options, opportunity, as you say. So then on the wheat, you can see there for wheat and soybeans, we're looking at, just because of the value of the crop, we're looking at higher levels. For soybeans, about 10 cents a point below the market level. And again, hopefully marketing decision would be able to help you recover that. But again, remember the 10 cent, the 5 cent moisture dock that you can get from at the elevator. So kind of there's the risk you go kind of back and forth in that decision. Well, to kind of summarize, we're launching into the next phase of this is to, again, kind of take a look from an IPM perspective on how we can manage our grain during storage and set up our systems where we can avoid problems later on down the road. So we want to check the moisture and temperature going in. That will give us a ballpark figure on how long we can store the crop. Obviously, now's the time to control those, certainly on the moisture side. We have a lot of broken corn, and we may want to clean it, separate that out before we put it in the bin. Certainly, it'll give us an improved storability. And we want to think about, obviously, we want to think about that maybe before the harvest season, how we may prepare for that if we have a lot of broken kernels coming in from the field. If we're as a livestock or as a grain producer, if you're marketing to local livestock farmers, you may want to screen the grain for mycotoxins, and again, segregate that in storage as it comes in to know what to move and how to manage the loadout. Again, if we're storing for the long term, we definitely want to clean the grain prior to putting it in the bin. And then the last point here, I'm going to launch into a full discussion of the sanitation, loading, aeration, and monitoring. And the first piece, of course, is sanitation. And as we're preparing for harvest, we want to clean out the bins, we want to clean out the equipment, we want to clean out all the pieces of equipment on the farm that the grain is going to come in contact with as it goes from the field to the storage bins. And along with that, we want to be sure that we look at the seal around the bottom of the bin. We want to be sure that it's intact and to repair that if we have any areas that need sealing. Also look at the foundations to see if in some of the facilities around they've been built on a fill, and we want to be sure that there's no erosion around the foundation pads or any structural potential problem with structural integrity of the bin or the other pieces of equipment around. We show on the right side there the dryer. We want to be sure and clean out those dryers. If we had wheat in that dryer from previous earlier in the year, we want to be sure that it's clean and out because as it sits there, it's kind of probably had attacked by insects and could be a source of infestation for the new crop coming in. We want to avoid that certainly. As far as in the bins themselves, we want to be sure and clean out the bins well. In fact, it's the best way to do it, in my opinion. You sweep down the walls and remove any spoil when it kicks along the walls. Broom and shovel get the coarse material out, and then back you get the lighter material. And you want to repair, when you're working in the bin, you want to be sure and look to see if there's any pinholes or any light shining through and seal those so we won't have any leaks or moisture coming in during storage. On the right, I'm showing a clean roof vent, but I've seen, couldn't find the picture I have of a vent with a lot of bees wings that tend to accumulate on the backside of that vent, and we want to clean that off with, a lot of times wind currents will get it cleaned off, but if it's not, you want to remove it because it'll tend to cake and it can form a rust spot in that spot in the juncture between the roof and the vent, and lead to leak problems down the road or to pinholes in that spot. I also want to be sure that we clean the area outside the bin. We want to mow down the weeds. We want to remove any. A lot of times we'll see some equipment stored in the bin, but it's best to get that area cleared, and so it's not an invitation for rodents. Insects can harbor there as well if it's not cleaned well. So when we're loading the bin, we want to avoid overfilling it because certainly this can impact the performance of our aeration systems, our drying systems, of fan performance, and the amount of airflow we can get through the grain. We want to also manage the trash and the fines in the bin itself. And again, that kind of goes back to the combine. That can certainly have an impact on how the combine is operated, how it's set. Just monitor the condition in the tank and see what adjustments may need to be made during harvest to prevent and minimize the amount of damage to the grain. Grain augers get kind of a bad rap, but if they're operated properly, you don't have to create excess breakage in the grain. But if they run full and at a high speed, you're going to have more problems, obviously. Or if you run empty, rather, and at a high speed, you're going to have a lot of grain on metal contact and a lot of damage to the grain. So you want to run our augers full and as slow as possible to meet the handling requirements of the system. Again, we want to clean the grain. It's best to clean it, obviously, if we're going for long-term storage or storing into the summer months. It's a good idea to use a spreader for smaller bins to distribute those fines. And if we can't do that or don't have that option, then we want to core the bin to remove the fines. And how we do that is a little bit different from different bins. And I'll discuss that a little bit as we go forward. But the bin we're looking at here is actually showing fines of the concentration of fines in the center of the bin, and how it impacts the movement of air through there is indicated by the size of the arrows. So all you can see on the grain is loosely filled around the outside. It's not as deep. It resists the airflow. So we have that's where if we're running a drying front or a cooling front through that grain, that's going to be the area that sees the change the quickest. As we go towards the center, it's going to be a little more slower because of the increased depth. But then when we get to the center of the bin, if we have a concentration of fines, it's going to block somewhat block the pore space there, and increase resistance. We're going to have much longer time to see a temperature change or a drying front move through in that area. So if we core that bin, as we're going to show in this animation, we want to get that grain surface in the shape of a kind of an inverted cone or a W pattern. And the guideline is there to use anywhere from a third to a half the diameter of the bin, and that diameter in that top inverted cone we're seeing there. And the other way to look at that is to the bottom of the cone would be about level with the grain on the sidewalk. Now, ideally, obviously, we'd like to see this leveled. I know that's a lot of work, but if we core the bin, it's kind of a compromise on getting good airflow through the bin and creating some space to work if we need to check the grain. For larger bins, it's a better idea to core those bins on a daily basis. We have more volume. We want to actually store those separately, or maybe take those onto the elevator. So on the next topic I want to talk about is condensation, dealing with moisture buildup in the bin. What we're showing here on the top is a crusted surface that's formed. If stored grain goes without being checked for a month or more, we can start to have problems. It's shown there, and that can be from a couple of different problems or sources, but oftentimes it's either condensation coming out the downspout, or it can be from blocked vents in the roof. We have a problem with that. We don't have good headspace ventilation. We want to be sure that as we're preparing for harvest, that those are clear and that we have good ventilation in the headspace as best we can. And this animated slide actually illustrates an aeration cycle as we're cooling grain in the fall. And I want to talk about this because there's some options we may want to consider if we want to upgrade our equipment. I think now's a good time to do that. But if we're running at 1/10 of a CFM per bushel, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about the size of the fan and the bin, but it's going to take about 150 hours to completely run that cycle through the bin, and we want to probably run those on a continuous, but run those fans on a continuous basis and within the target moisture or target temperature range to impact and generally cool the grain about 10 degrees a month as we're going through the fall. And then we'll have about 3 cycles. I'll talk about that a little bit more detail. Generally, we have about 3 cycles of aeration going into the winter. Conversely, if we have 1 CFM per bushel, it'd be a much larger fan. We'll take a look at an example of that here in a bit, but it only takes about 15 hours of total fan time to completely change the temperature in the bin. And if we're running a large fan, we can be a little more selective with when we run that, and we want to probably run it at night when we're especially, as I said, for cooling wheat in September, under the night when we've got temperatures in the range that we need to cool it by about 10 degrees. So you need to want to run 2 consecutive days at 7.5 hours each. So you're looking at the line shows the average monthly temperature in Kentucky across the state. So it's very a little bit up and down between the region. But the idea when storing grain is to run the fans to control grain, keep it about 10 to 15 degrees within the outside monthly air temperature. And you'll see in September, October, we'll have an opportunity to cool it to about 60 degrees or lower. And again in October, 50 degrees or lower. And then in December, 30 to 40 degrees, 35 to 40 degrees. And then we'll hold that temperature through the winter. We want to seal the fans after we've cooled it out. And so we prevent any wind-driven air currents from rewarming the grain in the spring. So we want to keep it cool and keep it cold as possible through the spring into the season. And hopefully we had to move it out before we have to deal with problems that come around in the summer. So how we can know how much airflow we have in our bins is to run a fan program that's freely available from the University of Minnesota. All you really need to know to run that is the diameter of your bin, the height of depth of grain, type of floor, which is a full perforated floor if you have air ducts. The program has up to 400 fans that are all available commercially. You need to know the type of grain, of course, because that impacts the amount of resistance to airflow. And then what the program gives you is the amount of airflow at different depths. So the example I want to run here is for 50,000 bushel bin. We can go with 10, we can go with 100, but we're going to kind of hit the middle here at 50,000 bushel. And we're going to say we're going to shoot to provide a half a CFM per bushel. You can see in the kind of the middle right side of the screen here, the input area. So it's a 48-foot diameter bin. The grain depth is 33 feet. We have shelled corn in there. We have the fully perforated floor. And when it's level filled, we got about 48,000 bushel. And for for that amount of airflow, we would have about, obviously, about 24,000 CFM. And at that height, we're going to have about 5 inches of static pressure. So we're going to need about 30 horsepower on the fans. We can, in this case, I selected two 15-horse fans, and we'll take a look here at the performance of that system. So you can see what the program gives you is the amount of grain at 3-foot increments, the amount of airflow that those fans will give you, this amount of static pressure it's generated and overcoming to provide that airflow. But in the column on the fourth column over, you can see the amount of airflow in CFM per bushel, and that's the main point here. And you can see when the grain is full, or the bin is full, we do have, in fact, have CFM per bushel, so we met our goal. And two other talking points here was just to show that well, again, at half a CFM per bushel, it took about 30 hours to cool that grain completely for one cycle. Whereas if we have, if we were to empty that bin, during the fall, if we were to empty it down to about 21 feet of depth, we'd have a full CFM per bushel. So then we only need about 15 hours of operation. We have about, again, at 21 feet of depth, we have about 1 CFM per bushel in that system. And again, this program can be run for any size bin, any combination of fans, and it's a great design tool if you want to upgrade the fans on the drying system, your bin dryers, or on your storage bins to increase the amount of airflow and reduce the drying time or do things differently. So we want to take a quick look then at the amount of the costs involved with different scenarios. And I've looked at a range of aeration rates that we typically see. The minimum rate, as I said, was about 1/10 of a CFM per bushel. And for that 50,000 bushel bin, in fact, we can get by with a 3-horse fan to provide that. It would take, in 3 aeration cycles, it would take 450 hours of total fan time. And if we were paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour, some folks a little more than that these days, but that's going to cost us $135 in electricity alone. But when you shake that out or pare it down into a bottom line, it's only about 0.3 of a cent per bushel to cool that grain. And as it turns out, if you have a 7.5 horse fan on that bin, you'll get a quarter of a cent per bushel. But again, fewer operating hours, about the same operating costs. Whereas if you had the example I shared there, the two 15-horse fans, it's going to cost about $270 of electricity, or about 0.6 of a cent. But still, again, if you compare that with some of the discounts of 10 cents a bushel for musty odors, for example, you can solve those problems with good aeration. And I'm going to go through this next series of slides fairly quickly, just to show kind of the progression of some of the tools we have available for monitoring stored grain. Obviously, if you have temperature tables in the bin, you can track the pace or the rate at which those air currents are moving through. You can track the aeration cycle, and if it's at different spots, if it moves through differently in different bins, you have it may tell you that you have been a problem with fines at one particular point. But the cables are also good for detecting hotspots. And in sampling grain or monitoring grain in areas deep below the surface where you can't really run a probe. So this is kind of a system. What I'm showing here is one that's like a plug and play. You get cables in the bin, you run around with a handheld monitor to monitor those conditions, and that's a 30-year-old system, been around for many years. Fast forward to conditions that we have today, where you can monitor those with your cell phone, and those are, and you can actually add another level of control where you can operate the fans according to the data that you see there, and on the screen you see maybe you've got a hot spot there shown in red where you would want to aerate the grain and cool that out. So some of the programs that are available, or some of the software that's available, I should say, some of the more sophisticated systems tied in along with temperature monitoring. You can also somewhat track inventory depending on the depth and then how you monitor the temperatures, which is this large system we're showing here is actually 26 cables in the bin. These sensors are actually about every 3 feet apart, so you're getting good information throughout the bin. So on the insect monitoring side, again, handheld tools that we've had over the years were pit traps, what you're showing on the right here, or a tried and true grain probe that could be used in a bin to collect samples, and then you can sieve those samples and look for insects. What I like about the pit traps, I've used those for some studies in the past, and you would want to monitor those about once a week, probably early part of the storage period, and then certainly for storing grain into the summer months, you want to insert those around the bin to monitor insect activity. But this is just a tube with holes drilled around the perimeter of that surface, and then at the bottom there's a screw cap that will the insects fall, and you can collect those, make the insect counts, and to know if those are primary feeders, secondary feeders, which is important to know as you manage the grain and control those insects. Obviously, there's more sophisticated equipment than just the handheld units or the inexpensive pit traps. You can get an electronic monitor. This is another plug and play that's made by OPI Systems. There's some others on the market, but it's similar to, in construction, it's similar to the handheld meter, but this one has an infrared sensor on the base that actually counts the insects as they fall into the trap. And you can monitor that either plug and play at the base of the bin, like the temperature cables, or you can fully automate that and record that, monitor that with a computer or a cell phone these days. So I wanted to just kind of quickly share, and at the end of the presentation, I'll have more information on the range of equipment that's available to help you monitor grain in storage. I think, again, as we prepare for storage, now's the time maybe to install those before you get grain in the bin, or if you want to upgrade the system. These can be very handy tools. If you've had problems in the past, these would probably be worthwhile. One technology that's emerging and actually shows a lot of promise, and in some ways it supersedes some of the systems I've talked about already, the temperature cables, for example. CO2 monitoring is becoming more in vogue and more widely used. We know that as insects and moles are active, they give off CO2. So actually, if you're monitoring the CO2 levels, you will probably detect respiration of those insects. And as CO2 levels increase, that will tell you that there's something going on in the bin. And oftentimes you'll detect that way before you'll see a temperature increase, which needs to kind of sit there and more or less cook, if you will, for a week or more. But the CO2 levels would show that much earlier. So some of those, I would encourage you to consider some of those if you've had problems in the past. And start winding down here by closing out on some of the monitoring tools. That some of the new ones that we're seeing. One in the upper right is made by Amber Ag. This is a small thumb-sized sensor that is actually inserted in the grain as it goes into storage. Then it's retrieved with a screen as the bin is unloaded. They're testing this at Iowa State and some other places, showing quite a bit of promise. And it's basically a temperature humidity sensor that you can, again, it's similar to a temperature cable, but it gives you a little more information. And then the other item I found of interest, I think, is shown on the left. It's called the GoV Wireless. This is available on Amazon. It costs around $20. But that little puck that you see there actually can be monitored remotely on the cell phone. It gives off temperature and humidity conditions in the bin. And again, if you see a temperature increase, you want to react by running the aeration cycle. So some of the costs of these options, again, compared to the cost of some of the discounts, if you've had discount problems for many loads over the years, you can quickly pay for this kind of equipment. And again, I think as we're going into harvest, we really want to think about installing some of these in our storage systems, our bins. Temperature cables are similar to fan control circuits that would be on the low end. But if you want to get a real sophisticated system where the temperature monitoring equipment itself, actually, you can program to control aeration systems, take the guesswork out of it. It's going to run you a little bit more money, but again, it's somewhat equivalent to some of the discounts that we're seeing. So kind of weigh those as you consider managing grain going forward. I want to close out quickly by mentioning we know that the safety aspects of storing grain. Again, grain quality and safety go hand in hand. If we have a problem, if we can avoid problems in the bin, we will have we'll have to go in the bin and try to break loose a clump of grain to be able to unload it. So a lot of information from different sources. Obviously, the short list here is if you're going into a bin for an inspection, you need to practice good safe practices. Obviously, the first piece of that is to have a lockout tagout kit and be sure that the unloading conveyors cannot be operated or will not be operated by anybody who's in the bin. Person going in the bin will need to have a well-fitted climbing harness, and a safety line is secured to a piece of equipment on the ladder or an added piece that would be able to support the load, a point load in the bin. Obviously, you're going to need a respirator, maybe a full mask, or just a cloth respirator, depending on the level of each person's sensitivity to dust. But you may also be exposed to mold spores in that environment, so you want to have a well-fitting respirator. You need at least two people to monitor, one person outside the bin to monitor activity going inside. The person inside needs to avoid the center, and it's a good idea to have a coffer dam on the site. And I know many of the counties there, the EMS services in the counties will have mock demonstrations on grain rescues. So closing out here, I want to share some university resources, and I encourage folks to kind of look at the neighboring states, because a lot of the recommendations are environmental specific, as we talked about there earlier. But those are the universities that have active research education programs in post-harvest management. Some of the other resources shown here, American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, that group, I've been a member of my entire career and have generated a lot of the equilibrium tables to see for different crops, and as well as other information on handling and drying. We recently updated the Midwest Plant Service Handbook on grain handling, drying, and storage, and we are now in the second printing of that. Is widely used as a textbook in technical engineering programs across the country. One resource you may not know about is the NC213 group, which is actually a consortium of scientists that work to address grain quality issues, comprised of engineers, plant pathologists, entomologists, agricultural economists, and from across the country, and they meet annually. But they do have a lot of the information that they have posted from the research on the website shown there. Another resource that's often, I guess, kind of forgotten about, but they do a lot of good work, is in the USDA Grain Lab in Manhattan, Kansas. And again, their information is on the website shown. The Grain Elevators and Processing Society is an organization that's very active across the country. We do not have a chapter in Kentucky, but the closest we would have would be the Feed and Grain Association. They provide, the Jeeps group provides a lot of training programs online, and encourage folks to look at that for what's available. And then, of course, the last thing mentioned here, I don't have all a laundry list of trade magazines that deal with post-harvest issues, grain production issues, but there's one that's shown there, and there's obviously many others. So with that, we'll close, share my contact information. Hopefully we have time for a few questions. I went through that very quickly, but I do thank you, and hopefully everyone stays well.
Great. Thanks, Sam. I'm going to pull up the next poll.
Okay.
And while I do that, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but go ahead and put those in if anyone has a question. While we wait to see if anyone has a question, Sam, I'm curious, given the economic times right now, if somebody needed a new system, would you recommend like the CO2 system or more of the traditional sort of drop sensors in a grain bin? Kind of how do those compare on price, do you think?
Well, so the CO2 sensor runs about the cost of a portable moisture meter, so around $300. There's kind of a trade-off with that. So it's pretty affordable, but you need to either be in the bin itself to take a measurement, or if you have an aeration system where the air is being pulled down through the grain, you could monitor at the fan the CO2 levels, and track that. And again, you're going to have to set a baseline and see if it increases in a weekly, short intervals, like a week or so, at the first part of harvest. So I mean,
and
I
if
think
you're
that's
pretty diligent with it, the CO2 monitor could be a cost-effective.
Yeah,
way
I've
to
seen
get
those
by,
used
right?
for flat storage, especially,
Mm-hmm.
and that fits well with that because they have negative aeration, where they're pulling air down through the pile, and that works quite well. So you have to trade off. You're not going to be able to monitor. It gives you an average, at that point. Right. Whereas with the temperature cables, you can really monitor down well below the surface. So.
Good morning. I'm Raul Villanueva. I'm the extension entomologist resident here in Princeton. And today I'm going to give you a brief information on the management of the bean leaf beetles and update on potential soybean pests that we are looking this season. So you have here the topics that I'm going to deal today. We have the bean leaf beetles, the tree-cornered alfalfa hoppers, and grape colaspis. So let's go and start with the bean leaf beetles. So bean leaf beetles are native insects of North America. and they have abundant hosts. A lot of legumes, wild legumes, were the main diet of this insect. But as soybean is an introduced species here in the USA, this insect adopted this as right now as the main host, so it feeds profusely in this plant. So you can see here the picture of a larvae of the soybean, and these larvae live in the ground and can feed on the root systems of many plants, but the damage is minimal. So the adult form that you can see here is the one that is a problem for soybeans. And you can notice also that this insect has many multiple forms. So they go from orange red to a tan with and without spots. So the distinctive mark of this insect, a distinctive way to identify is this triangular shape in the pronotum. So once you find this pronotum, you basically can say that this is the bean leaf beetles. So here I'm showing you the phenology of the life cycle of this insect. On top is a illustration based on how it emerges. So they overwinter as an adult. So around May, June, start to come out and start to feed on plants, and then also mate and lay eggs. So these eggs are going to hatch, and then probably by middle of June, we start to have the first generation of bean leaf beetles. So in addition to that this first generation probably is going to continually feeding on the leaf foliage and also start to lay eggs. By middle August, September, we have the second generation of bean leaf beetles. And this second generation is the one that's going to overwintering until the next year. So as you can see here, these populations can fluctuate depending on what's happening. Environmental conditions are important because if there are more rains, for example, they can kill a lot of these insects, or flooding, or also with cultural practices. If you do some tillage, also they can be reduction of these populations. This graph also illustrates the presence of the insects on the different stages across the growing season of soybeans. You can see, for example, the adults that are overwintering came and remain in the fields up until May. Then we have the first generation. And then after August, we have the second generation. So also these insects oviposit probably from late April all the way until September. And then the larval form is feeding underground, although they don't cause too much damage. So what's important here is that this insect feeds on soybeans during the entire growing season. So that's something that we need to consider for the control. So again, here I'm showing you the principal stage of this insect and how it affects soybeans. So the overwintering adults are especially problematic when the plants are very tiny. So if they come very early and the plants are just emerging and they start to eat on the tree foliage or on this type of cotyledonal leaves, the plants can be reduced on number on field, and you need to do a replanting. The first generation feeds on the foliage. So insects can cause a lot of damage on the foliage, a lot of feeding, but this feeding, the soybeans can grow very rapidly, this problem. However, the second generation also is important because these insects feed on the pods and they can reduce yields, and then also affect the seed quality, and they can transmit a virus. So why this insect is important is shown here. This is a report published this year, And this is based on data from 17 states. So on this, you can see that bean leaf beetles compared with the steam bugs, it causes a loss of 2.8 million bushels in these states. So that's a lot of money. So although the steam bugs have higher bush lost, 2.8 million is significant. So that's what we need to study. And this is, I believe, an emerging pest in soybeans. So in 2018 and 2019, we did some insect efficacy tests in small plots. On 2018, we used Warrior. This is a pyrethroid leverage. This is a dual mode of action insecticide. It combines imidacloprid, a neonicotinoid, with pyrethroids. And then in 2019, we added Hero. So, and Hero is also a dual mode of action insecticide, as you can see here. The rates were what the manufacturer recommended. And we did this in a replicate study using small plots. Now, in 2020, we are also repeating this test, but in this occasion, actually, we have the two insecticides that have a dual mode of action, Leverage and Hero. But in addition, we are testing with 3 pyrethroids, Baythroid, Warrior, and Mustang Max. And in some of the studies, we are using also Lorsman. So let's see what's happening. So these are the results for 2018. On top, you have the number of bean leaf beetles per 10 sweeps. So and you can see that after we did application on August 23rd, there was a reduction on bean leaf beetles. So the bottom picture shows you the accumulated bean leaf beetles. This is the same data, but illustrated in a different way. So you can be able to see the differences of these populations. You can notice here on the bottom, the leverage really reduced the pest numbers, the bean leaf beetles after these applications, while the control was very high, followed by Warrior on black. Okay, so let's see what happened in 2019. So in 2019, we did a spray on July 31. So this was 23 days before the 2018. And you can see here, so that our application, it has a small reduction of on the bean leaf beetles, but then they start to go up again. So it seems that our application didn't have an effect. And you can see also there was no differences here when you see the accumulated bean leaf beetles. So what happened here? This is important, and that's why it's important to see the phenology of this insect. I believe that when we did application in 2019, we were targeting the first generation bean leaf beetles. So these first generation bean leaf beetles were at this time probably dying. So they were moving, or they are not going to be affected. This before the application, this first generation actually was moved out. So what we counted after that was the emerging second generation. So and this second generation was not affected by our pesticide. So in 2020, I will do this study again. I'm going to spray again, but around August 23 to see the effect on the bean leaf beetles. Now, what's important also here is to see how effective is the insecticide spray, or how long does it last when you do that application. So for this reason, we collected the leaves from the field, the ones that we spray, and we collected the leaves 1 day after the application, 4 days after the application, 7 days after the application, and 14 days after the application. So after we did that, we check for the mortality 3 days, 24 days, and 3 hours, 24 hours, and 96 hours after these studies were conducted. And you can see here the mortality 1 day after the application in all the treatments were very effective. So we're around above 20, 30% for all the control, for all the leverage and warrior. But after that, 4 days after the application, this mortality was reduced. So, and if you can see here, 7 days is very similar to 4 days. But if you see 14 days after the application, the effect of the pesticides basically is completely reduced. So when you do this type of applications, probably that the effect of these insecticides is no more than 7 days. So what happened? Now we're going to see how it affects the feeding of these insects. So you can see on top the pictures, 96 hours after the feeding. You can see here on top, this is the control. The middle one is leverage and the bottom is warrior. So you can see that leverage was really very effective. So they almost don't have any feeding. So and this is what the picture is showing here. Yes, because I want to show you that this is on the left side here, you have the insecticide treated plants. So, and these were very similar to the untreated plants. So the control has the same number of effect. The leverage also was reduced and warrior is okay. So this indicates again that 40 days after the germination, probably in the field, there is no difference on the effect of the insecticide seed treatment. So you need to be aware of that. So after 40 days, 20 days actually in the field, you need to do spray applications. So here are the yields for 2018 and 2019. In 2018, we have some issues with the combine. That was some problems there. And we have here, but in spite of that, the control has a lower yield, but you can see here the standard error of the mean is very high. So there were no significant differences among these treatments. In 2019, we have almost yields that were similar. So no significant differences based on the insecticides that we used. Now, this is only advance on what we have been doing in 2020. In 2020, we are looking into the fields and we are counting great numbers of grape colaspis. Grape colaspis is an insect that not only affect soybeans, but it also can damage corn. In corn, actually, on seedlings, they can eat the root system and can kill plants. So what's happening here, when we tested the same 4 days after the application, we see that the percent mortality across all these it's not very great. So it means basically it's all similar to the control. So this is 4 days of their application. So probably if we do the test 1 day after the application, the mortality is going to be very similar to the bean leaf beetles. So what's interesting here is how much defoliation they cause under these tests. So you can see here the leverage has a very low defoliation compared to the other insecticides. So the pyrethroids are very similar to the control. Probably there's no significant differences here. So 4 days, this is 4 days after we conducted the application. And again, this is a bioassay conducted in the laboratory as I showed you before. Now, another insect that's present in the fields of soybeans are the three-cornered alfalfa hopper. In 2019, actually, we have some data that these insects respond differently to pyrethroids. So when we spray in the field for bean leaf beetles, the bean leaf beetles were reduced while these insects were not really affected. This insect actually causes girdling on gall formations on the stems, on soybeans or peanuts and many legumes. And I'm showing you this because last Friday we went to a field with a great drake on Butler County. So you can see that there were many plants that were large in there. So these insects, it seems that very, very abundant on this field. And you can see that probably 1 to 2% of the plants were lodging. So I was not able to count the insects, but because we have a very big rain. So you can see here, this is a picture that I took, and you can see that the gold formations where this insect was feeding. Okay. So in addition to that, also I'm not showing anything here, but it means we are studying the effect of these insecticides on the Japanese beetles. That this year again we are seeing great numbers on soybean fields. So probably later on or next year, I'm going to be presenting more data on this and other insects. Thank you. Any questions? Hello.
Thanks, Raul. I'm gonna go ahead and start the next poll. And while we do, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but I do have a question. I'm curious, you said that bean leaf beetle can be particularly devastating early in the season, right? So do you see this being more problematic with maybe some March and April plantings that some of our producers are trying to push?
Yeah, if the temperatures are right, correct, to awake the population, the overwintering population of bean leaf beetles, they can cause a lot of reduction of plants on the field. So sometimes probably they be confused with maybe slugs damage or even other type of insects.
And how long do you think that the seed treatments will be effective for bean leaf beetle?
The seed treatments probably are effective for 20 days in the field. I've seen the maximum time probably is 40 days. So that's based on the 40 days that I mentioned here is based on laboratory studies that we conducted here.
So you think if people are pushing those early planting dates, maybe about 2 to 3 weeks after planting, they need to start scouting and seeing if there's any issues?
Especially when the plants are very tiny. So and when we see the first initial leaves, when they're just emerging from the ground, that's the time that these insects, the bean leaf beetles, are actually problematic.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Raul. Okay. I'm sure that if people have questions, they'll reach out to you as well.
So again, I appreciate you having me on today and attending here. So we'll go ahead and get started. So just giving you guys a little bit of an update for 2020. So let's go ahead and get started. I can get this to advance. There we go. So it wouldn't be a corn and soybean field day without talking about dicamba. So we'll go ahead and cover this. So just give you a little update. As you guys know, as of June 3rd, there was a ruling that canceling the dicamba labels, at least for XtendiMax, Ingenia, and Fexapan. So the EPA took that ruling, and what they decided that is every one of those products that you had in hand or had purchased as of June 3rd, you could still apply up till July 31st. So today is July 28th, so you have a few more days to apply those 3 products if you have them in hand. But the reality is most fields should have already surpassed the restrictions for these products to be applied over the top, which is 45 days after planting or R1. The exceptions are probably going to be a few double crop beans that are out there. Those probably certainly haven't hit the 45-day, and I think there's some of them that probably aren't at R1 yet, but they'll be getting there pretty quickly. So if you are in a situation you still need to apply to some double crops after July 31st, again, I think that's going to be pretty rare, but you can still use Tavium. It is still allowed, and Tavium is dicamba plus S-metolachlor or dual. So that is a product that's available to you. But that label does expire in December as well. So essentially, all of these dicamba labels were set to expire in December anyway. So all of the companies were preparing new packages to resubmit. So everyone was prepared to resubmit packages. So that wasn't a surprise. This year was just a surprise of that a little bit earlier cutoff on those 3 products, and having to have things in hand on June 3rd. So as far as the future of dicamba, it's still pretty widely unknown. I'm not even going to speculate what's going to happen with the future labels or what future labels will be available. We just have to wait and see what the EPA is going to do with it. I would say this ruling that came down in early June is going to make things more difficult to get full labels back. But we just don't know what next year is going to look like as far as what dicamba we will have available or when we can apply that. So again, I don't really want to speculate what that's going to be, so I'll just kind of leave it at that. I will let you know that, things have been pretty quiet as far as dicamba injury went, all the way up to about 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago is when all the calls really started coming in for me. I think there was some of it happening before that, but it was just in areas that people were used to it, and they really just didn't feel like they needed to let me know, or didn't. It was just so common in some of those areas that they didn't really report it. But I have been getting some reports the last couple of weeks, and they seem to be coming from more of central Kentucky now than western Kentucky. But I would say we're still getting some dicamba injury in western Kentucky as well. So just to kind of give you some updates on that, and that's both injury on soybean and tobacco. So I've seen both soybean and tobacco with dicamba injury this year. So not as widespread as in past years, but just to let you know, it is still happening. So with that in mind, let's move on and talk about what I kind of want to talk about here today is, how moving forward, how are we going to manage these weeds? Specifically, the top 4, the ones that are most troublesome to us, Palmer amaranth, water hemp, mare's tail or horseweed, and I'm also going to throw ryegrass in there as well. We're not controlling it with dicamba by any means, but I think it's something we need to have on our radars. All of these we have confirmed to be glyphosate resistant within the state, all 4 of these. So Palmer and water hemp kind of rise to the top. So does mare's tail when it comes to soybean. And so as I go through the rest of this talk, those are the weeds I'm really going to focus on. But I do want to bring up the ryegrass as, at the wheat field day, I talked about ryegrass pretty much exclusively. And that's what I do in wheat is look at ryegrass. And I'd mentioned that we're going to start screening or do a large screen of ryegrass. And after that talk, I got a lot of emails and calls saying, hey, we're having trouble with it in front of corn too. So that's why I want to bring it up here is we need to keep an eye on ryegrass because it's certainly a problem in wheat, but I think in the coming years, we might start seeing it become a problem in our corn acres and potentially if we're selecting for glyphosate resistance in our soybean acres as well, because we do rely heavily on glyphosate for our grass control in soybeans. So just keep that in mind, keep an eye out for that weed. We don't want it to sneak up on us. So this is a slide that I used all winter long. And so, I am recycling a slide here, but I wanted to do it for a reason. And that is, as the winter went on, I talked about what all your guys' options were. And at first I said, they're unlimited. And then I said, no, it's actually pretty overwhelming, all the options you have. And now with the unknown of dicamba, are we going to have dicamba products next year? Are we not going to have them? Are they going to be more restricted labels? It's kind of unknown at this point in time. And so that's what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what are some other options if you don't, you have to make your own decision on what soybeans you're going to plant next year. I can't make that decision for you, but if you're not confident that dicamba is going to come back, and I really, again, can't tell you, look at some other options, and there's plenty of other options out there now, and also look at some options for the future. So to go ahead and start off with LLGT27 soybeans. So I think there were some acres of this planted this year, and I suspect in the future we'll see more and more acres of this technology being planted. I know there's guys that are excited about it. So the LLGT27 beans, or Liberty Link GT27 beans, what these have tolerances to is glufosinate or Liberty, glyphosate, and HPPD inhibitors. So HPPD inhibitors are going to be bleachers, okay? So, you know, having all these tolerances gives you a lot more flexibility as far as what each of these products brings to the table. You know, as far as over-top applications, glyphosate still working well for grass control as of now, and glufosinate, there's no secret about it that glufosinate, it's weak on grasses, so that's why it's nice to have the glyphosate in there. But glufosinate for that mare's tail, the water hemp, and the palmer, it's picking those up, it's helping you out with those, and so that's where this really comes in. You have the option of spraying either glufosinate or glyphosate, or many guys are actually applying them in a tank mix together, which so far has been working pretty well. Although, you know, we have seen some instances of antagonism. So just be careful with that as you move forward. But so far, that tank mix has actually been working pretty well together. Now, the unique thing about these soybeans is that they are HPPDA resistant, or resistant to isoxaflutol. Isoxaflutol would be an active you're used to seeing in the balance products that you use in corn. So you can now use this in soybean, on this soybean, and it is labeled as Elite 27. Okay, this can only be applied pre-emergence in front of the soybeans. It is not allowed to be applied over the top of these soybeans. It's limited in limited counties in Kentucky, and I'm going to show you that next. And really, we want you not just going out with Elite 27 as your pre, but Elite 27 plus another pre-emerge product. So the reality here, guys, is that no matter what we're spraying in our pre, we want multiple actives out there, because the fact is that our multiple sites of action, because the fact is you guys are applying HPPD inhibitors or bleachers in your corn years. So we need to, even though it's great to now have this site of action available to us in soybean, if we rely on only this in soybean, plus maybe glyphosate or glufosinate, and then you go into your corn year and you're also using HPPD inhibitors, we're putting pressure on that side of action. So we need to avoid that, and part of the way we avoid that is by mixing it with other pre-emergence products, other sites of action, a group 14, a group 15, or a group 5. So put it in there in pre-mix. We have looked at this for 2 years now. It works really well in those tank mixes. And again, the advantage this has is it's giving us another side of action. So, and in our post acres, we have some flexibility. So I do want to point out here for Elite 27, this label is pretty new. Here are the counties. The counties in red are the counties that are allowed to spray Elite 27 in Kentucky. So I have listed that at the bottom, and I have them in red on the map. Okay. This is all based around, this is kind of the first generation of this label, and it's all based around endangered species. That's what's selected these counties. These counties are allowed because it was determined that this product would not be a threat to those endangered species within these counties. So, so certainly if you're in this area, which produces a lot of soybean, you guys are in luck because you can use it. I'll be honest with you, I don't make it to this side of Kentucky often. I'm not going to say they don't grow zero. I'm not going to say they grow zero soybeans, but I don't think there's a lot of soybean production over there. But certainly if there is, you guys can spray Elite 27 too. The hope is that in the near future, there will be more counties added to it. But I do want to highlight this. If I'm going to talk about Elite 27, I want to make sure to highlight that it is restricted to these red counties. Okay, so if you're in another county, unfortunately, you cannot apply Elite 27. You have an endangered species that is threatened by this herbicide. So moving on. The other option, and an option I think got adopted quite a bit this year, is the Enlist E3 soybean. And most guys I've talked to, they are pretty happy with them, pretty happy with what they're seeing with them. And with the Enlist E3 soybean, what you're going to get is, again, glufosinate, which would be Liberty resistance, glyphosate resistance, and 2,4-D resistance. Okay, so we like this system. I like this system because it has a lot of versatility and a lot of flexibility. We, again, Glyphosate works really well for grasses so far, so continuing to have it in the system helps us out with grass control. And then for your glyphosate-resistant broadleaves, your water hemp, your palmer, and your mare's tail, you have options. You can spray Liberty, or you can spray 2,4-D, or you can spray both, either together or in sequential order. So there may be some fields that you put some Enlist beans in, and then somebody plants some sensitive crops right next to you, and you decide you don't want to take the risk with 2,4-D, you still have your glufosinate available to you. So obviously we can still drift both of these, but so far these products are looking pretty safe. You guys have been able to apply this pretty well. So even with this system, with all the flexibility post-emergence, you still have to have a pre out there. It doesn't matter if you're dealing with palmer, water hemp, mare's tail, or really any weed, we still want to pre-emerge out there, but we like that flexibility of if you get into a situation where 2,4-D just isn't safe, you have glufosinate to back it up. So we like that. And also you can apply them together or sequentially and get more sites of action out there to protect both of those sites of action. So just gives you a lot of flexibility. To talk just a little bit about the products that are available, Enlist One is just 2,4-D choline. Okay, so with this product, you can mix it with, again, a glufosinate or glyphosate product, or if you want to apply just 2,4-D and glyphosate, you have Enlist Duo. So at the full rate of Enlist Duo, which is 4.75 pints, that's going to give you a pound and a pound. So I think a lot of guys like going with the Enlist One because that allows them to get their pound of 2,4-D out there, or half a pound of 2,4-D out there, whatever they're going with, and they can add in however much glyphosate they want. So it gives them a little more flexibility on the glyphosate. So it's kind of up to you, but both of those products are available to be applied to the Enlist soybean system. All right. So just to talk a little bit here about some injury that I've gotten some calls on this year. Nothing that's surprising, but I think for a few people, it may have been a little bit of a surprise or maybe a little more extreme than they expected. So this is in an Enlist soybean field, one of our trials, and this is Enlist Duo plus Zidua. So remember, Enlist Duo is glyphosate and 2,4-D plus Zidua, and we get a little bit of pucker on those leaves, and we expect this. I think everybody that's applied Zidua, Warrant, Outlook, or Dual over the top of the beans has seen this little bit of strapping or malformation. It's nothing severe. It's nothing major, nothing to get too surprised about. But with these beans, because you can't apply glufosinate, so here we have Liberty, Roundup, and Zidua. And by having that Liberty in there with the Zidua, we do see it a little bit more of an extreme as far as that malformation goes, and it almost frays out the end of the leaves there. And you can see that where it's fraying the end of those leaves. So it's a little bit more surprising. And sometimes before that fray happens, you see some necrosis. Okay. Guys, for the most part, this is not hurting your yields. It's not hurting your soybeans. It is a little bit more extreme than what we expect just with a Zidua glyphosate product. But when we do add the Liberty in there, we do get just a little bit more burn, but it's nothing to be too worried about. But I did get a few more calls on this year. And I have pictures with Zidua. It's not just Zidua. Warrant does it too. So does Dual. When we put this many products in a tank post-emergence, we do get a little bit more malformation of those leaves. But for the most part, you're not losing yield, and we want that group 15 in there, giving you a layover residual. You're getting the full benefit out of that. So, but just to make you aware of that happening. To continue to talk about systems, again, you guys will still have the Roundup Ready 2 Extend soybean system available to you next year. At this point, though, there's a lot of unknowns. If for some reason we don't get dicamba back, these will essentially be Roundup Ready beans. So just be aware of that. I'm not saying you're not going to get dicamba back, but until we know more, we just can't really make a lot of great decisions on this system until we know a lot more about the dicamba labels and what they're going to look like in 2021. All right. Moving on, the Extend Flex system. So just want to mention this. I think the best thing that can happen for us is that this gets approved and this is available for us next year because with the Extend Flex system, you'll have glyphosate, glufosinate, and dicamba resistance. So with this, even if you have limitations or major limitations on dicamba, you still have that glufosinate or that Liberty option within this soybean system, and that's great. This is really what we need. It'll match up really well with what the Enlist system's offering you right now with both glyphosate and glufosinate and a growth regulator. So right now we're still waiting on European approval. Bayer really expected to have approval by the first or second quarter of this year, but we all know what happened back in March and has been happening since. Everything in the world has slowed down, and that includes all the regulatory stuff. So we're still just kind of in a wait and see pattern, but the hope is that maybe we do get these Extend Flex soybeans. So just keep waiting. As soon as we know we have them, I'll probably send something out to let you know. Okay, to wrap up here, I'm going to mention this because it's been the hot topic the last 2 days since this weekend. Okay. Unsolicited seeds from China. So I'm going to go ahead and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull up the link here. They're on the KDA websites. They have their official release. There's a nice video here for Brian Corals talking about it. But essentially what's been happening is people have been receiving seeds from China that they did not order or they did not want. If you get this, let the KDA know immediately. Let them know. You can here's their contact information, and they're going to request that you send it to this address here. I'll go back to my PowerPoint here, to this address right here. And that's where they're going to have you ship that seed. They're trying to figure out what's going on with the seed. But don't throw the seeds away, and most certainly do not plant those seeds. We just don't know what it is. We don't know if it's a hoax. We don't know if it's some type of terrorism event. Nobody really knows right now. I'm not going to speculate on what's actually going on. So let the KDA know, let them handle it. They're trying to figure out with APHIS what these seeds are and what's occurring with them. So if you get one of those packages, contact the KDA and they're going to have you send that seed in that package to here. So seal it up really well. Don't throw it away. Don't plant it. All right, so that's all I'm going to have on that for right now. And then lastly, if you haven't gotten enough pest management today, there's another virtual field day on August 20th from 9 to 11. It will not be the same information you got today. It'll be expanded information. It'll be more, a little bit, at least from my side, a lot more research results and looking at plots. And we'll spend a good chunk of a morning talking about all that. And we'll also give you some links to some plot tours, at least from the weed science side. So if you want to attend that, if you haven't gotten enough of us so far, enough of the weed scientists, plant pathologists, and entomologists, you can go to that link right there, weedscience.ca.uky.edu. And this is where you're going to land right here. Just click on this here. It's going to take you maybe to this page. There's your link, or you can scan the QR code. It'll take you to a registration exactly like what you filled out to come to this one. So you guys all know how to do it. Register for that, and we'll be glad to have you on August 20th. So again, you won't hear the same thing from us that you heard today. So you'll get even more information. So if you're not tired of us, that's where it's at. With that, I am on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. I've been trying to release more videos and pictures this year, trying to be more interactive on Twitter. So follow me, send me an @ if you have a question. I'm glad to talk with you, answer any questions you have. So with that, I'll take any questions. I saw there are several chats that popped up here.
Great. Thanks, Travis. I think some of that's just housekeeping chats. Okay. I don't see any questions at the moment. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll for those of you that have stayed to the bitter end. We really appreciate it. I hope you got a lot of good information. While you're taking this poll, a couple of final housekeeping things. Go ahead and sign out, and by that you can send your information to Colette Morlant, or go ahead and send it in the chat box so we know that you've signed out for CCA and pesticide credits. Also, if more than one person has been viewing, Travis, it looks like you did get a question. If more than one person has been viewing from your location, please let us know how many people were at that site so we can get that in the numbers, and I'll hand it back to Travis. So the question is, how quickly do you think we'll see resistance in either palmer or water hemp? And I'm assuming you're talking about dicamba. If you've been, there was a release yesterday, actually, about Tennessee has confirmed dicamba resistance in palmer. So
I would say pretty quickly, pretty soon. Usually once Tennessee finds something, it's within a couple of years that we start seeing it. I don't think any of us are surprised by it, at least weed scientists, and I hope you guys aren't surprised by it either. So I'd say pretty quickly. And again, that's where having these additional technologies or traits where we can apply either glufosinate or the growth regulator is a huge advantage. So we can cycle those different events.
Good morning, everybody. Wish we could be outside talking, but as Carrie mentioned, we have to do some things a little bit differently today. So I'm going to talk about a problem that's an issue every year. So this is a disease that no matter what the weather is, no matter what kind of year we have, this is a problem that is likely stealing away some of your soybean yield. So I'm going to talk about the soybean cyst nematode. And you can see from my opening slide here, I've got the soybean cyst nematode or SCN coalition logo that's up there. So just wanted to take a minute and talk about the SCN coalition. This is something that started back in 1997, actually. And at that point in time, I think that the logo or the slogan, "Take the test, beat the pest," was used a lot. And that was really telling growers that, hey, you might have this problem. You should go take soil samples and send those off to a lab to determine if you have soybean cyst nematode in your field. So several years later, the problem is still there. It's actually spread, still causing yield loss. Although awareness of this problem was increased back in the late 90s. I think a lot of growers just started using resistant varieties and sort of thinking that the problem's taken care of now. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. So there's been a reboot of this soybean cyst nematode coalition in a couple of years ago, back in 2017. And again, the purpose is to bring awareness to the yield loss that this pathogen causes, but to also talk about new management options that are available. And so this coalition is funded by Soybean Checkoff and industry partners. And I've got the website listed up here at the top. It's thescncoalition.com if you want to know some more information about this particular initiative. So I think about every 3 years, this map gets updated. This is the known counties in the U.S. That have soybean cyst nematode. The last time, in fact, they're updating this map in 2020. It's time to update it again. But this is the most recent public version of the map. Since 2014, there's been 34 new counties that's been added to the 2017 map. And you can see I highlighted Kentucky there with 3 new counties. And as you look at Kentucky, you can see that pretty much all of Western Kentucky does have soybean cyst nematode. Now, it may not be in every single field that's in Western Kentucky, but it is present in every county in the western part of the state. So we are also starting to add counties in central and northern Kentucky. You can see some counties there in which it has not yet been observed. I can tell you that for the 2020 map, we're going to be adding several new counties in central and northern Kentucky as well. So depending on where you are, especially if you're in western Kentucky, this is an issue that you should consider when you're thinking about soybean varieties and seed treatments and how to manage this particular pest. So the soybean cyst nematode, the Latin scientific name is Heterodera glycines. You can see these with the naked eye. So what you're seeing here are the actual females of the nematode, those little white structures there that's on the root. A little bit hard to see with the naked eye. So if you had a hand lens, but everybody always has their phone with them. So actually just go into the camera mode and just zooming in can really help you see these little female nematodes that would be on the roots. Don't get these confused with the nodules, the nitrogen fixing nodules there that are on the roots. Those are going to be much larger. So just another picture. I took this picture at one of our trials in Davis County about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And if you kind of zoom in here, you can see in that red circle, you can see these little lemon-shaped females of the soybean cyst nematode. And I'll zoom in there a little bit more where you can see those. So that's what they're going to look like. So you can, again, see these with the naked eye. A cell phone or a hand lens will help you see those. If you are looking, and now is the time to go look, if you want to actually dig up some roots and look, you need to be very gentle with these roots. So you need to carefully dig. You'll need to have a bucket of water with you and then gently wash off the soil that's on the roots. And then you can look for these females on the roots. So just a close-up of what those females or those cysts actually look like. So once those females die, we call them cysts. And you can see they kind of turn a tan to a brown color. And this is obviously a close-up. If you look inside of those females, what you're seeing there are hundreds of eggs, those little white hot dog-shaped structures. And so one of the reasons why this is can be such a problem is soybean cyst nematode has about a 30-day life cycle. So it takes about 30 days from infection to produce eggs. And so you can have several generations depending on what type of weather you're having, how long the season is. You can have several generations of the soybean cyst nematode within your field. And if you're growing a susceptible variety or a variety that's not very resistant, you will definitely increase the number from when you're planting to the end of the season because of the number of eggs that these females lay. Now, back in the day, we would see, like in the 70s and in the 1980s, we might see large areas of the field that would be affected by soybean cyst nematode. This is actually a picture from Iowa from an airplane showing those large areas out in the field that are yellow or dead in some cases. So that would be severe damage by soybean cyst nematode. And in those situations, we might see up to about a 50% yield loss. We don't really see those situations anymore. These are the type of symptoms that we see now, which is basically no above ground symptoms. Part of that is due to a number of varieties that have some level of resistance. There's maybe been some adaptation by the soybean cyst nematode where we don't see as much above ground damage, above ground symptoms. However, even though we don't see those symptoms, we can still have a yield loss. Here's some more data here from actually several states that was published a few years ago showing that the difference between resistant varieties and susceptible varieties when there was no above ground symptoms, and you can see that there was a 10% yield loss. So and that yield loss is, that's a little bit conservative. In fact, it can be even more than that, even when you don't have above ground symptoms. So we kind of think of this pest as kind of being that silent robber that just comes in every year and takes some of your yield, because it's not something that you can see just from looking at the field. That field may look very healthy, but it just may not be yielding quite what you thought it should be. Maybe you used to get 65, 70, maybe 80 bushels an acre in that particular field, and you've kind of capped out at around 55 or 60 bushels year in and year out. Soybean cyst nematode might be contributing to that yield loss or the non-ability of achieving those yields that you really think you should be getting in a field. Lots of ways to manage soybean cyst nematode. We really need to start off with knowing what those numbers are. So collecting soil samples from your fields, the best time to do that would be when there's not a crop out in that field. That's going to give you the best, most accurate count of the soybean cyst nematode eggs that are in your field. So that means basically sometime in the spring before you plant, or sometime in the fall at harvest or just after harvest. Collect soil samples. We want to go to about a 6 to 8 inch depth. We want to, if soybeans were the crop that was in the field, we want to try to push that probe right into where into that row where the root zone is. Resistant varieties is one of the first steps. Now, if you look at a seed company catalog, you're going to find that just about every variety we grow is going to have some level of resistance to soybean cyst nematode. And one of the major gene or the major source of resistance that's used is known as the PI 88788 that you can see there on the slide. So that's been a great source of resistance that breeders have used for a number of years. The only problem is sometimes we can have too much of a good thing. And so what has happened over the last several years is that the soybean cyst nematode populations have begun to adapt to still be able to reproduce on varieties that contain that source of resistance. So we're seeing a shift of populations in which this source of resistance does not work as well as it used to. Unfortunately, in our region, just about every variety that's going to have soybean cyst nematode resistance is going to have that source of resistance. Fortunately, there are companies that are looking at new sources of resistance. Peking is one of those. It's not a new source of resistance, but it's one that's been used, and companies are starting to take that back off the shelf and utilize that. And in fact, there's even some newer sources of resistance that companies are now starting to look at and develop varieties from. And so we're anxious to see some of those new sources of resistance being utilized for our maturity groups that we grow here in Kentucky. Crop rotation is very, very important for management of soybean cyst nematode. Anytime we grow a non-host crop such as corn, we're going to reduce that soybean cyst nematode population by up to about 50%. So just 1 year of corn, we can reduce that population by 50%. Where we are most likely to find fields that are going to be hit the hardest are those in which the farmer has grown continuous soybean. Those are the fields where soybean cyst nematode is really going to ramp up and probably going to be causing some of those yield losses. Finally, we've got a lot of choices for seed treatments and especially nematode protectant seed treatments. This is something that we really didn't have in our arsenal 5 or 10 years ago. We just had a few, but now we have a whole lot. So I'm going to just focus on a couple of things here because of the lack of time today. The first thing I want to focus on is collecting those soil samples and bring to your attention that thanks to the Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board, we do have some free testing available for Kentucky farmers. So this is a program that was initiated in the fall of 2019. It is continuing for 2020. So the Kentucky Soybean Board is providing funding to test a total of 400 soil samples for Kentucky farmers. And to kind of figure out how to do that, we had to allocate the number of free samples by county. And so if you're interested in this program, contact your local UK County Extension Office for details on how to submit samples. Check with your agent and see if there are still some of those free samples allotted. Now, again, as I said, right now is probably not the best time to test. At this stage, it would be best to test during the fall after harvest or during the harvest season. So from 2019, from some of the samples that came in this route, as well as a separate soybean cyst nematode survey that some of our county agents participated in across the state, we found, here's the results that we found. First, let me kind of point out the risk of yield loss based on the number of eggs, as you can see here on the left. Once we get to 500 eggs per 100 cc's of soil and above, that's when we go from a moderate to a very high risk. So as you look over here to the table from the samples that came in from 2019, you can see from this gray piece of the pie all the way up to the blue piece of pie, we've got about 40% of the fields that had at least 500 eggs per 100 cc's of soil. So that means at least a moderate risk. So about 40% of the fields that were tested would fall into one of those categories where it's likely yield loss is occurring. So Keep in mind that it is definitely prevalent. A lot of our fields in Kentucky have soybean cyst nematode at levels that will cause yield loss. The other thing I wanted to focus on here today was the nematode protectant seed treatments. And I'm going to bring up a table here. This is a very busy table, but the point of this is to show you that we do have a lot of options now. And so this would have been a very small table just a few years ago. So a lot of companies have really invested in looking at products that might help manage soybean cyst nematode. And I'll bring your attention here to the active ingredient list here, this column that I've highlighted. As you look through this list, you see a few things that are in italics. And so those are all like Bacillus firmus, this Pasturia here. These are all biologicals. So those are actually living organisms that have been utilized here as seed treatments. So some of these are microbial biologicals, whereas others, as you look here at Levo and Saltro, those are a couple of products that are chemicals. Okay, so we have some products that are biologicals and some that are chemicals. Interestingly enough, this Levo and Saltro, those are also both fungicides, and those are both fungicide seed treatments that are especially good at managing sudden death syndrome. So not only do they provide some management against a fungal disease, they also have some properties that have the ability to help manage soybean cyst nematode. So we do have a little bit of data in Kentucky from looking at some of these different seed treatments. The first trial that I conducted when I was here at UK was back in 2016, and this was a trial that was funded by Bear Crop Science, who at the time was the owner of Ilevo. Since then, there's been some swapping going on, and Ilevo is now actually a BASF product. So this was a trial that I conducted at several locations, along with the UK soybean variety performance trials that are conducted by Dr. Claire Vinard. So you can see those locations highlighted there. We looked at 3 different seed treatments. One was just a base, so that was just a fungicide plus insecticide. And then we had Poncho Votivo, and then we had Ilevo that was added on to all of those. We had 3 different soybean varieties in that trial that we looked at all those locations in 2016. So this is the summary of all locations 2016, looking at yield. And so our base is fungicide insecticides in blue, and then Poncho Votivo in black, and then the trio of those 3 in the striped bars there. And you can see there was one variety in which we did see a significant yield response. That's what that asterisk means there. And that was this particular variety here, where we did see when we added the Ilevo that it was significantly better than the base product. Some additional trials that we conducted in 2018 and 2019. In fact, we're also conducting this again this season in 2020. This is funded by the Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board. And you can see we've tested this again at on several locations with the soybean variety trials. So in total, I've got 16 environments when you combine 2018 and 2019. A number of products that we evaluated. So this was just on a single variety, but looking at a number of products here. And this is what we saw for yield across all those locations in 2018 and 2019. Our naked untreated check here is in black. That base fungicide insecticide is in the checkerboard. And you can see our different products here and the yield associated with those, the average yield associated with those products. So we didn't see any significant differences when we combined 2018 and 2019, looking at all of these products compared to the base or the untreated. So in summary, from our seed treatment testing results, and this includes trials that we've conducted here in Kentucky, as well as talking to my colleagues from other states, lots of variability when we do these trials. Sometimes we see an effect on yield, but certainly I think there's more testing that needs to be done. This year, we've tried to target a few more fields that we know have moderate to high levels of soybean cyst nematode. So it'll be interesting after this season to see if we see some bigger differences in some of those fields. Overall, again, it's very important to test your fields. Utilize the free testing that the Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board is paying for. Crop rotation is very important. Resistant varieties, it's important to switch up the varieties year after year. And then again, consider those nematode protectant seed treatments if you've kind of done all these other things and you think that you're still having an issue with soybean cyst nematode. So with that, Carrie, I'll give it back to you and try to answer any questions that may have shown up here.
Thanks, Carl. While I think you've at least got one question in the chat box, and while you address that, I'm going to put up the next poll.
Okay. So the question, soybean cyst nematode can be very patchy in the field. How do you deal with this when taking a soil sample? That's a very great question, and certainly the distribution of soybean cyst nematode is going to be erratic. So it's important to take several soil samples. What we typically recommend is within a 40-acre section of a field that you try to take at least 10 subsamples within that 40-acre section. And then you can bulk those, and that would basically be one sample. The other thing is to use a pattern, like a zigzag pattern, when you're going through the field. And basically, just like for all soil samples for nutrient analysis or whatever you're doing, the more samples you take, the more accurate number that you might have to help you make a good decision. So just taking a few samples from one little area of the field is probably not going to tell you the whole story. You really need to take a lot of samples and use a zigzag pattern to try to get the best information.
And Carl, I have one question for you. I'm curious. I've worked with a lot of producers over the years, wanting to really maximize yields and wanting to hit that 120 bushel, sort of yield average for their fields. Many of them say that they feel like they've plateaued on yield. Do you have any kind of perspective about whether or not SCN might be making them plateau, or if there's other things maybe we need to look at rather than SCN?
Well, I think soybean cyst nematode would be one of the first things I might look at because that is typically what we see is, as I mentioned, you don't necessarily see above ground symptoms, but you might just kind of plateau and not get to that next level that you really think that, based on the field that you're in, that you really think you should be able to achieve. So I think testing for soybean cyst nematode would be one of the very first things I might do, just kind of see where you're at, in that level of population.
Great. Thanks, Carl. I'm sure if y'all have any other questions that you think of, Carl will be available via email or what have you.